street, coming up that hill, and the ice.
Welcome this evening. I am Jim Stillman. I am campus pastor for United Ministries in Higher Education, and this semester I've been teaching a course on the Holocaust. And about 6 weeks ago, one of our students, Trina Derrickson, came to me and said there's a cantor in Omaha who is a survivor of Auschwitz. Is there any chance we can have him here? And just the next day or so, I saw a flyer about the Anne Frank exhibit that was in Omaha. And on the final evening of that, Cantor Fettman and Dr. Fred Cater from Omaha were on the agenda to speak. At this time, from 6:30 till about 7:45, we're going to listen to Dr. Cater, and then at 8 o'clock we will hear Cantor Fettman. Dr. Cater was born in Belgium in 1938 near Antwerp. At 3 years of age, he was separated from his parents, who died at Auschwitz. All of Dr. Cater's nuclear family perished in the Holocaust. He spent time in a boys' camp and was shipped when he was 3.5 years old to a connection with a train to take he and other children with him to the death camps in the East. Through, I'm going to use the word fate, he was not able to make that connection and was hidden by nuns and by others in Belgium, so that he is with us to share his story today. Dr. Cater was educated in Canada by various institutions. He was raised by his great aunt and came to the United States to do an internship at Johns Hopkins University in pediatric neurology, and came to Omaha to serve on the University of Nebraska medical staff in 1974. The story that he tells and that Dr. Cantor Fettman, it's difficult, tells are two of the most moving stories I have personally heard about the Holocaust or otherwise. And it is a real delight to have Dr. Fred Cater with us to tell his story as a hidden child this evening. Will you join me in welcome?
Thank you all for being here and being so kind of giving up your time and evening to listen to this personal story. Thank you for your kind words. Actually, this story as I'm going to tell it has only been put together over the past 6 months. It's only been 6 months ago, or a little longer now, Memorial Day weekend of this year. I attended a conference of people who were hidden as children during the war to survive. It's terrible tragedy that happened. And only at that time, that simple memories, a few better. It's a lot of things in the back of the room. As I was saying, it's only in at that time that we went to reflections that I had, a few memories that I had, really came together. And the people that I met knew more about me than I knew about myself at that time. Meeting a gentleman who had research on hidden children in Belgium, and these 500 children who were in children's camp across Belgium, and in this way managed to survive this terrible inhumanity of man to man, this Holocaust that occurred. People who actually were there with me, who were older than I was, I was 3 years old at that time, who actually snatched me literally from off the train that was getting ready and was bound for Auschwitz and death, final solution. Indeed, this is how I turned out to be not one of the 6 million Jews who were murdered during this dark period of time, and to humanity to man, as well as the 6 million non-Jews who were murdered during this time. We're talking about one little life in this vast number of 12 million people who were murdered. And why exactly this occurred and how I ended up surviving, really not so much a story, I don't think, of fate, but of the goodwill that the individual can have, the desire that one individual can make a difference in this world, that one individual can want and not on top of, but actually do something, help another individual. In this way, really make a difference as individuals, a member of the society of the world. And really because of all these few most precious, definite little lights shining in this darkness of this humanity of man to man that I'm here standing in front of you today. It seems like a lot of Jews during that time in Europe, Nazis were rounding up Jewish families for deportation to the concentration camps, to the death camps, to the ovens. In Belgium, the majority of people were taken to a concentration camp called Malines. And from there, he boarded the train of the final destination, of the final solution, which was the death camp of Auschwitz, that the Nazis had well prepared. By the time they invaded Belgium, which was the summer of 42 and months, this process was already ongoing. Myself and my family were taken from Antwerp, where I was born, and deported to Malines. Somewhere, and what exactly, and how exactly things occurred, I really still do not know. But somehow or other, is well recorded from people that I met who were there, that became separated from my family, even within this concentration camp, which was area at all. At the time the following sequence of events occurred, I lost my mother on the train to Auschwitz, and 300 brothers have been documented in the archives that the Nazis had. Things were well documented as to what happened to people. Which convoy they were assigned to go to Auschwitz, which number of the convoy they had, and these are records that were well documented by the Nazis, and how indeed this information was to survive after the war, so that people knew what had happened. And the end of October then, a train was bound coming from northern France, taking the next shipment of Jews from this concentration camp of Malines out of Belgium to Auschwitz for final extermination and final murder. It turns out that that train was late coming out of France. And it was late because they had to round up people, Belgian Jews, who had been transported to labor camps in northern France. And they decided at that point that they had served enough time in labor camps and it was time to send them on to their final destination. And that train turned out to be late, coming out of northern France back into Belgium. And it is also during this time that a group of children with elders who were looking after them in a Jewish home in the heart of Belgium, outside of Brussels, a place called Wiesenbeek, were suddenly one day just picked up by the Nazis and told that they were on their way to Auschwitz. We're talking about 63 children, a couple of elders, and one person was left behind in the Wiesenbeek camp, who was a simple young woman, non-Jewish, and so she stayed behind in the Wiesenbeek camp. This camp had been put together by the German occupation forces. Everybody who was Jewish had to be registered in Belgium, like in France, like in Poland, like in Germany, wherever, so that at any one time the German occupation forces and unfortunately the Nazis knew exactly where the Jewish people were, and children who were orphaned for whatever reason were put into these children's camp across Belgium. And one of these camps, Wiesenbeek, with 63 children, one day the Nazis just decided that they didn't have enough people to fill the quota to go to Auschwitz and decided to liquidate this camp. And so the whole camp was sent by convoy to Malines, 63 children and some elders, and they landed up at the end of October, also in this camp, also in this concentration camp, and also got there at the time that the train for northern France was late. There was just enough hours that the care that one person had, that little young non-Jewish lady back in the camp at Wiesenbeek, there was just enough time for her not only to think of what was going on, but to really decide to do something about it on her own as an individual who cared enough to help. And she got on the phone, and it took her most of that afternoon, from what I've gathered from visiting with people in New York, to contact the other children's camp to warn them what was going to happen, because the first camp had been liquidated, and to tell them what had happened and where the camp children had gone. As the other camps got this information, there was obviously connections, and the information got back to the Queen of Belgium, Queen Elizabeth, who actually had taken, from the beginning of the war, a very specific interest in children. And she had decreed that anybody under the age of 16 who was born in Belgium was under her protection, regardless of race, creed, religion, personage. And that information eventually, during those critical hours, got back to Queen Elizabeth. And there was enough time for her, through the German Army Command, to get information passed down, and that somehow, and for the love of God, I don't know how, they were able to get the Gestapo and the Nazis to rescind that order, to get those children to leave the concentration camp, and the children were given permission to go back to Wiesenbeek. This must be the first ever that I have ever heard of the Nazis rescinding an order of death. And the train was late, and so these children were still in the concentration camp, and so there was time for them to get out and go back to the children's camp. Of the 63 children that were there, obviously the age range was from very young to probably the oldest at around 10 or 12. And indeed, at that time, well, you may be 10 years old, you're obviously a very mature young person at the age of 10 going through that kind of an experience. And as well, being 10 years old, I don't know if any 9, 10-year-old is ever going to listen to his parents or to any elder for that matter. And a group of them about 4 or 5 just took off and started to wander through the concentration camp into the different buildings. And in one corner were about 5 or 6 children just sitting very quietly, as if they were there but not there. Sitting very quietly so that they would be seen but not seen, so that they could be not heard, as if these little children knew that if anything would occur, if they would make any noise, it would be found, and the difference between life and death was being quiet, seen but not seen, and not heard. And so these 5 or 6 children were seen by these older children, who then went back to the rest of the group of the 63 children who came from Wiesenbeck. When the time came for the children to leave the concentration camp, because they had been given permission to go back to the children's camp, these same children had enough presence of mind to run back to this corner of this building where we 5 children were, and I was one of them. And we were picked up, and as the trucks rolled out of the concentration camps, we landed up on the truck ride back to the camp instead of on the train that pulled into the concentration camp soon after that, and then went on to Auschwitz. And this is how I survived, and this is how I got out of the concentration camp. I met the gentleman, Marcel Giannacchi, who was the one who was the youngest of that group of children of age 10 to 12, who picked me up, who came back to this corner, dimly lit building, and we were picked up, the 5 of us, and taken back to the children's camp. The same train that was late, that came from northern France while I was on my way by truck to the children's camp out of the concentration camp, was actually carrying my uncle. He had been deported to northern France to the slave labor camps. And that train got to the concentration camp. The train was loaded with more Jews bound to be murdered. And my father was on that train now. He was put on that same train the day that I got taken out of the concentration camp. My father and my uncle actually met on that train. And because these people had come out of the slave labor camps and were younger and were healthier and were able to survive the rigors of the slave labor camps, actually about 250 of those people managed to jump the train while still in Belgium and survive and escape the death camps. My uncle talked to my dad about jumping the train, and he didn't. Even then, though people knew what was going on, it was hard to believe that this would occur, that people could be murdered by other people. And it was hard to believe that this could happen to him, and he didn't. And this was the price he paid with his life. My uncle survived, managed to get back to Brussels when he knew he was going to get picked up by the Nazis to go to concentration camp. He had hidden his children with some Gentile friends that he had in Brussels, who looked after his 2 children while his wife went into hiding somewhere else. Knowing where they were, as he found his way back to Brussels, picked up his wife, they got their children, and they went to southern Belgium, where a simple farmer and his wife hid them during the rest of the war, in the middle of a field in a small shack with a trapdoor underneath. And that's where he survived the war, by the grace of simple people who felt that they could make a difference and did something about it to indeed manage to enable them to survive. It was after the war that I eventually got reunited with my uncle. But here I was at the time, both he and my father were on the way, as he was on his way to the death camp to his final destination. I was on this truck, going back to the children's camp. And this indeed is the first recollection that I have of the first 3 years of my life. Riding in a truck, an army-style truck with a canvas top, where the tailgate was raised to form a back stop to within the truck. And a chair was dangling, a wooden chair, dangling from this tailgate as it was raised, so that as the tailgate would be down, you can then step up into the truck. And so the tailgate was raised, and I remember this chair banging constantly, making a terrible racket in this darkness while we were driving. And I was told that I was crying all the way. I guess at the age of 3, I wouldn't be able to do much else, being afraid of what exactly probably was going on, and probably at that time thinking the worst of the worst, and yet that was the ride that was to save my life. And that is the first recollection that I have, and about the only early recollection that I have till towards the latter part of the war. And I spent the time then in this children's camp with these other 60-odd children, knowing that I was Jewish, although at that time that didn't mean much, obviously at the age of 3 and 4, wearing a Jewish star that identified me as a Jewish child, and indeed, strictly because I was different, like 12 other million people, being singled out for it by the Nazis. I was one of the more fortunate ones surviving. The other 12 million didn't, even though I was different. I remember towards the end of the war, we're now looking around already 43, the end of 44, and at that time, I recall being in a convent, and I recall the evenings especially when we would be at the end of a children's bed with the railings at the end of the bed, being on our knees, and at that time I didn't know there were rosaries. They were just black beads that were fun to play with. And maybe I should have known what they were. I think I would have prayed a little harder to make sure I did survive. But this time is the first time that I recall really being in any sort of a religious affiliated situation. So we were in a children's camp that was Jewish. There wasn't really much religion at all that was partaken of during that time. Time was spent surviving. And it turns out that the recollections that I have of being in this church and in this cloister was indeed very real. I met people after the war who could tell the exact date that happened when we came from the Wiesenbeck camp to the church, to the cloister to live. And it wasn't by choice. It turned out that the Nazis were ready to run a déjà vu phenomenon. They were ready to exterminate the camp for a second time. This was the time that the Germans were retreating through Belgium. And the Nazis figured that they weren't going to be in Belgium very long, and it was time to murder a few more Jews. Only by this time during the war, the Belgian underground, which was quite extensive at this point by non-Jewish people, was working together with the Jewish underground in Belgium. And before the Nazis were able to carry out their plan, the plan became well known to the underground. And I gather it took all of about not even a couple hours to liquidate all the camps. And at this occasion, though, it was done voluntarily by people who knew we had to get out to survive. And this was the first time, indeed, that we were taken out of the camps. We gave up our Jewish identity, because obviously walking onto church property, walking into any kind of non-Jewish situation, these people who were willing to take us in were putting their lives in the forefront, without any consideration, without any care, without any kind of worry for their own safety. We're taking in Jewish people, Jewish children in this particular church, this particular convent cloister, and their life was on the line. Anybody who would be found harboring a Jewish person would obviously be shot on sight, on the spot. And unfortunately, whether in Belgium or in Denmark or other places, there was more than one family of a minister or a priest that were murdered by the Nazis because they took the time and the care to try to hide someone of Jewish background, whether a Jewish child or a Jewish family. And so we had taken off our coats that had the Jewish star. The Jewish stars were torn from any kind of clothing and buried. And I remember that being done outside of the church ground before we actually walked into the church.
And then I remember, the only thing I remember of that period in time was indeed, as I was saying, spending the evenings saying supposedly night prayers. I wasn't praying very much, unfortunately, playing more with the bees than praying. And I think at this point I appreciate not only black bees, but even blue and white bees, even Jewish bees, whatever it takes to help. I look back now and appreciate where that feeling comes from. Then as the Germans were indeed pushed out of Belgium, eventually we went back. We were able to go back to the camp with the liberation forces there. And I remember walking back into the camp, and this camp was now totally decimated. There were broken pieces of metal bedding, beds lying strewn about. There was nothing else to be found. No mattresses, no covers, no window covers, nothing. The camp was totally bare except for broken beds, and that's the way the Nazis and the retreating army left the camp. I was to stay there not only to the end of the war in 1945 in Belgium, but a couple of years more. And I was indeed one of the last children to get reunited with family or with close friends. And basically, because it took that length of time to be found, as still having survived the war. My uncle, who after the war came out of hiding in southern Belgium with his family, went back to Brussels. And at that time in Belgium, like everywhere else all over Europe, people were looking for families, for members of their family, close friends who were still possibly alive. And by pure accident, my uncle bumped into an old acquaintance who was now working as a social worker, and I think she was as shocked to see him alive as he was shocked to see her. As he mentioned, that he and his family were the only survivors of our extended family, and my father had at least 6 brothers and 4 sisters, saying that as far as he knew there was no one else that he can track down. She mentioned that actually there was a little boy with the same name who was in a children's camp, and that of course turned out to be me. And so this is how I finally was able to leave the camp and went to live with my uncle in Belgium, in Brussels, for a couple of years. And so after the war, I was then in Belgium from 1947 to 1949, before a great aunt who was alive, living in Canada, who actually had left Europe in the 1930s, the early 1930s, heard of me through correspondence between she and her nephew, my uncle. And this is how I came to Canada, where I grew up and went on to school and then college and university and medical school. As I look back on things, if not for the care, if not for the decision that people made, not out of any great reward, not out of the need for any great self-pat on the back, but just because people decided they were going to make a difference, they were going to do something to help someone else. This indeed is how I landed up being saved. The little light that was shining in the darkness of the Holocaust time, of man's inhumanity to man, is how I survived, and how I got the chance of being able to do something more with my life than just give it up at the age of 3. I don't think it's an accident I'm a physician. I don't think it's an accident that I'm a pediatrician interested in kids. I don't think it's an accident that I'm even a pediatric neurologist. Obviously, I've been given my life to do something with. You kind of look back and you wonder what better way there is to serve man than to serve man. What better way there is to serve the world than to be of help to another individual and children. Obviously, the end result, because this is what happened to me at the time that I was most vulnerable, at the time that I really was most dependent on for everything in life to survive. And if you look indeed at neurological problems of children, that's probably one of the most devastating things that children can go through, neurological difficulties. And so I'm sure the end result of why I'm a pediatric neurologist. And that is really not all that unusual. It's nothing great. It's nothing really to be patted on the back for. If you look at what hidden children have done, 90% of all hidden children have gone on to make careers in the health-related fields of helping people, whether they were physicians, psychologists, social workers, special educators. And of these 90%, there was also a fair number who, rather than going into the health-related fields of wanting to help people, actually became artists, whether musicians, whether ballet dancers, whether wood carvers, or whatever field of art and creativity you want to name, and whereby they could express their feelings, they could express their experiences of what happened to them, and in this way share them, with the rest of the world. And in this way you account for 90% of survivors of people who were hidden children, who have grown up and have overcome this and done something for themselves, and I guess some sort of an inner drive that just became the natural thing to do. Having been given a second chance, having been given, your life handed back to you because of the care that someone had, the natural thing then was the evolving of indeed probably giving of oneself back to humanity. And this accounts for what happened to a lot of the hidden children. The meeting in New York was the first time there was a World International Congress of Hidden Children. People came from all over the world, from back to basic European countries, Belgium, Poland, Denmark, Holland, Germany, Austria. People came from North America. People came from Israel back to New York. And as you spoke to these people, the same ideas, the same philosophies kind of came through. I think I look back and see the thing that really, as I put this story together for myself 6-7 months ago, the thing that really hit home more than anything else was not that I survived, but the fact that I survived because someone else cared to do something, to remember, not just to think, or to read, or to talk, or to hear, but cared enough to give of themselves to do something for another fellow human being without asking any questions as to why and who you are, not to single you out because you're different, but to do something for someone else because we're more similar than we are different, because we are citizens basically of the world, basically of humanity. And indeed, this is why I wear this pin. I took it from someone in the ADL because it said we can make a difference, and we can, and we need to, and we must. I think as better philosophers than I have ever said, we're going to live to regret the day where we're going to have to relive history again unless we do something for our fellow man. Thank you.
We have plenty of time now for questions, and if you'd like to address those to Dr. Cater, please feel free to do so.
Did you go through a period after you, probably after you came to Canada, where you had to kind of come to terms with everything you've been through as a child? Did you have to have counseling or any kind of help?
Let me repeat it. She's asking if, when he came to Canada, if he went through a period of having to examine this and needing counseling and help to work it through. So.
Actually, when I came to Canada, I was 11 years old. and probably wasn't smart enough to realize I probably needed help. I think like all kids, 10, 11 years old, you know it all at all times, no matter what happens. But indeed, being very fortunate to come into family and really getting the therapy that I needed within the family setting, being accepted as another son, which now I acquired a family, which really was a family for the first time. Living in Belgium with my uncle, I was living in my uncle's house. I was there as a nephew, not as a member of the family, and indeed, I was there for all of 2 years. And I remember thinking when I came to Canada that well, this is going to be a similar kind of experience. I'll be there for a few years, and then we'll figure out where I'll end up next. But fortunately, I was taken in as a member of that family, and the family just grew by another one. And so I had 6 brothers and a sister, and indeed, the safety of the situation, the stability of the situation, the saneness of North America certainly made a big difference. Attending a regular school, not a catch-as-catch-can situation, because after the war, school may be run one day but not the next, depending on was there food available in the post-war Europe situation. Were there people there to provide the facility that children needed to stay in school, heat, electricity, and school would open and close, whenever, which way, whatever would happen. And so being in a much more stable environment, which was nurturing, which was indeed physically stable, emotionally nurturing, psychologically safe, I sort of went through that kind of, I guess, therapy without knowing what I was doing. And so I probably was able to, pull out of it, because of that. I grew up in a much more sane fashion, going to school regularly, learned English instead of French, my maternal language. So I must admit it's only been recently that I finally, when I get mad, I finally quit yelling in French. My children, the natural tendency that you have of having a first maternal language in the height of excitement or emotionality, you forget what you learn, you go back to your basic primary language. And so it was very great when my kids were small. I could yell at them in French, they wouldn't understand what I was yelling at. It was mutually beneficial, cathartic for me and not so devastating for them. But probably this is what probably saved the situation as I grew up early on. Many children, many survivors had much more traumatic post-war experiences than I did, and indeed needed this kind of major help and support psychologically, psychiatrically, to put their lives back together. It's not unusual to hear of hidden children who after the war just didn't talk about their experiences like I did. I really didn't have much to talk about to begin with, and I really wasn't interested in talking about it, something that you want to repress. But even in families where hidden children did want to talk, you were still looked at as being someone who was obviously much more fortunate to have survived, to have the roof over your head, to be fed 3 meals a day. And what do you have to complain about? You survived the war. How do you complain as opposed to someone who survived the horrors in the death camp of Auschwitz? So for a long time, hidden children just wouldn't listen, didn't want to talk, kept as silent as they grew up, as they had been when they were younger, to make sure that they survived and not rocked the boat. And it's taking 45 years. Enough time has gone by for the survivors to have been able to tell their stories, for the children of the survivors to go through the psychological turmoils that they went through. 45 years have now gone by where the hidden children have matured and finally said it's time. We were given a chance to tell our story and the problems that indeed many of them went through.
Bryce?
Yeah. Have you been back to Belgium, or would you like to go back to Belgium and for a visit to visit some of these places?
The question is, has he been back to Belgium and he would like to go back? Would he like to go back?
Actually, I've not been back to to Europe since that time, though I've got the intentions of going back. My cousin, my uncle's son, who survived and still lives in Belgium, has actually been here, and I've actually been in Omaha and enjoyed the stay very much. His brother, who actually moved to Israel after the war, has also been here to Omaha, Nebraska, and I've been also up in Canada, Montreal and Toronto, where we have family, and I have all the intentions in the next year or so, next few years or so, to go back and indeed to go to Israel via Belgium. I'm not so sure I'm ready to go back yet to the heart of the Holocaust site, to the final dead place, and pay my final farewell respects to my parents. I think that's what it's going to take to finally put this episode to rest in my own mind, to be able to go back and do that. And I think as time is going by, as I've learned what's happened, one day I will do that. I think psychologically I'm not quite ready for that yet. I think you learn to be strong, you learn to mature. Sometimes it takes a little longer to mature in some areas than others. I think I'm still hopefully learning. Hopefully I never stop learning. But we will go back and indeed somewhere down the road make that kind of a side trip into Auschwitz.
Elizabeth French.
How has your children and your wife taken the reaction of what's happened to you, and how do they relate to it nowadays? I mean, how has it affected their lives?
She's asking how his wife and children have had their lives affected by his story that's come out recently. So.
Actually, I guess I was one of the fortunate ones in New York. When I went, my wife came with me, and my daughter went. She wanted to go. My oldest son, unfortunately, was unable to go, being in medical school, being a fourth-year medical student now here at the University of Nebraska, and his time is not his own. My youngest one, actually at that time, was finishing his last year at the University of Arizona, becoming a psychologist. And it's also interesting that they're all in a person-oriented helping field. My daughter herself is a graduate of Madison in special education, got a bachelor's degree in science and special education for retarded children, which is what she's done for the past few years in Omaha. But I was fortunate enough to have my wife and my daughter come with me. And indeed, the weekend that happened on Memorial Day, which was so electrifying and so rewarding and yet so painful, was actually shared by them. So we learned the story together. And being at home to Omaha and learning to what it meant, appreciating what it meant, actually tightened the family more. I think certainly I'm better off for having known, and I think they are realizing a little bit better where I'm coming from in terms of wanting them to really grow up with an education, the importance of getting that education so that they can be independent, so that they can be self-sufficient, so that they may not need to be so dependent on someone else during their lifetime. Be able to appreciate how significant it is to have that education, to be of help to others, to be able indeed to carry this on. I think it's bonded the family obviously more. It's made us appreciate each other more. You realize that the people you have the most closest to you are your family, things you take for granted, things that we realize we can't take for granted, things that we got to realize we have to do something about to maintain those ties and those relationships. And so we're much more active in being of support to each other, of being there for each other.
Back here.
Did you ever lose faith in God, or how do you feel about God now?
Did he ever lose faith in God, and how does he feel about faith in God now?
I guess the one consolation of being young is that knowledge is wasted on the children. I just didn't appreciate what was going on when I was 3, 4 years old. first taste that I had, as I was saying before, of religion was being in a convent and thinking it was one heck of a great game to play with beads. It wasn't until after the war that I obviously indeed learned to appreciate that I was Jewish. And in Europe after the war, there really wasn't much time for religious sentiment and learning about religion. And I was all of 9, 10 at that time. It wasn't until I came to Montreal that I learned that being Jewish was more than just somebody who's different from someone else. You realize that you were very much more similar to a lot of people, and indeed you just looked at how you practice your living mores and folkways and values just in a different kind of manner. But that's really where I became Jewish and learned by going to post-school, post-regular public school, Jewish schools, learned what religion was all about. And I think as Reverend Tillman said, maybe it was faith. And that got me to survive. I think it was everybody in their own way practicing their belief in God and doing something about it. That rather than faith got me to this point. And I think you learn to accept that things work in different ways, and sometimes in very unexpected ways and very unusual ways maybe. But I think there is one God for all of us, and I think the way you practice I think should be according to your own conscience and dictates, and you relate to other people as a function of the same, regardless of who they are or what color their skin or what religion they have. I think that's irrelevant. I think if you want to be a citizen of the world, you want to believe in what's right and what's wrong as you see it, and as is the basic beliefs of your religion. I think that's the way you live. And it's not a matter of going out of your way or doing it. It's just the way you are, because that's what you believe, according to your faith.
We have a question over here. Richard?
Well, I'm curious, on the radio last night, you talked about being seen but not being seen while you were a child. I presume especially after the camps were evacuated, the orphanages were evacuated. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, especially on how that felt? You realized that, of course, you weren't very old then. Jim, you discuss in greater detail how you were seen and yet not seen, what that's like.
I think, being as young as I was, it's hard to recall, as you said, as I've said before, what exactly happened back then. I think it's from the meeting that went on Memorial Day in New York, that you really heard the same story from different people, from different hidden children. No matter what age you were, you somehow very instinctively acquired the knowledge that survival meant being quiet, survival meant not being seen, survival meant not making extraneous noises. And why was it that 5 children at the ages of 3 to 6 or 7 were sitting there in the room all by themselves, so very quietly, so very, visibly invisible? What we were doing there, how did we get there? How did we get separated from, whatever families we had while we were there in the concentration camp? I think you learn instinctively what you have to do to survive. Children who were in hiding, or parents with their parents, or with others who were in hiding, you learn instinctively what to do, so to speak. You always have to be one step ahead of the Nazis. You had to be able to fit into nooks and crannies where you were there but you weren't there. People were hiding in the attics, like Anne Frank. People were hiding in cellars and in sewers, wherever they could, so that they would not be seen, not be noticed. And indeed, as I said, this kind of carried over after the war, where this thing was inculcated into your being, because this is what enabled you to survive. I don't think it's an accident that hidden children didn't speak out for 45 years. It's only more recently that people have gone back. And I've gone back to places where they've been hiding, where they were hidden as a youngster. Sauvage went back to, for example, France, and made a movie out of Le Chambord, a little town of 5,000 people in the middle of Vichy France, in the middle of the part of France that collaborated with the Nazis. And yet here was a town in the low mountains of that part of France of 5,000 people who hid 5,000 Jews. They just lived there, period. Somebody made a movie in Belgium and had a French title as if it were Yesterday Comme Si C'était Hier. Went back to find out where it was that she was hidden, where it was that Shoshana Run was hidden. Why was it that people just did this? And indeed, people felt very uncomfortable when the movies were being made. You know, why are you singling us out for having done something? You know, this is just the way we are. This is just the way we live. This is, you know, as I go back and said, this is, you know, the way we practice what we believe, you know, our religion, you know, of helping others. You know, the door is always open. These people felt very uncomfortable movies being made about them. But yet this was done, and the French underground was indeed exposing this movie by Shoshana Run and for what they did. And people were very uncomfortable for a while, but I think in time, though, the word is being spread. The hidden children are speaking out. Indeed, the most moving part, I think, of the weekend, besides finding out who I was the afternoon that people were recognized for having been righteous people, having been righteous Gentiles, who were really sort of pulled by the hand to come forward and to be recognized for what they had done, putting their own lives on the line to save other people. In Germany itself, in Berlin, 5,000 Jews were saved. In Berlin itself, during the Holocaust, during the war. Mind-boggling that little lights can shine in the middle of this dark inhumanity of man to man. But I think that's where it's at. That's the way the future is going to have to be. That's where we're going to have to obviously stand up and be accounted for. And obviously the interest you people have in being here reflects on that. And for those who have survived, and for myself, thank you for being here.
I was going to say, you mentioned brothers. Do you remember your brothers and how old they were and or anything about them?
No, I don't remember any of that at all. I'm not even sure that I can tell how many brothers or sisters I really had. I know.
Your uncle didn't tell you that either?
I think after the war we talked very little. I think he had jumped the train, survived. My father hadn't, and that must have had a weight on him. He told me the story, but he wasn't ready after the war. After the war, I don't think he had the heart for it himself. He was trying to forget what had happened to him. He had to come to peace with himself. Most of the facts are actually written in this book, which is a commemorative of the actually 40,000 Belgian Jews who lost their lives. And this is taken directly from the archives of German records of who went in which transport train, on what date, at what time. A lot of people had to forget to put their lives back in order to start living normal lives again. I was fortunate I just did it from the ground up. I just had to start living. And fortunately, I've been able to find out life didn't begin at the age of 8 after the war. There was a past, and it has a lot of bad things to remember about it, but it has a lot of good things that have happened there, which is why I'm here.
Because I'd be curious myself, I just would wonder, I think, but...
I think I'm actually in the process through the Red Cross of doing this, trying to get more information. The Red Cross, ever since the time of the war, has put out an extra humanitarian effort to try to find information about who is where, and if you've got a name in a town or a village. The Red Cross is in the process of doing this. In fact, besides my own immediate family, since the war I found out that I apparently have an uncle who's alive somewhere in Russia as a dentist. He got out of Europe and found his way into Russia. Somewhere in God knows where. A little name that I can't even pronounce, the town, with all these X's and Y's and all these strange Russian letters. But through the Red Cross, we're trying to find him after the war. Being Jewish, living in Russia, he wasn't too keen on communicating with anybody. Afraid for his own life. Now that not only the Berlin Wall has crumbled, but the Russian Wall has crumbled. Through the Red Cross, we're trying to see if we can locate him. The last we know is he may have been in what used to be called Stalingrad. I had a cousin who managed to get out of Russia who knew him back in 46, 47, right after the war. And he just wouldn't communicate back with us. At that time, the letters went one way, and we never know if they even got there. So through the Red Cross, this is being done, and it's still being done all over the world through the Red Cross. And I know that this is an ongoing process through Israel and what's called the Yad Vashem. There is a Holocaust memorial in Israel and a whole available records and archives of what happened to people through the times of the Holocaust. And even through there is a chance of being able to find something out. And I know people have done that as well. But those are the really two big ways of trying to find what has happened to members of your family or to other ones. And that's still ongoing now, and I'm still involved in that as well.
Do you have anything in there on the Gunskirchen concentration camp?
I beg your pardon?
The Gunskirchen concentration camp, do you have anything in your book on that?
This book is strictly on Belgium. And the concentration camp in Belgium, really the only one was the one in Malines. In France, there is a similar type of memorial book that's actually, it's got 2 volumes. In Belgium, 40,000 Jews were murdered. In France, the number was actually closer to 100,000. But yet, from the records available from the archives that the Nazis themselves had, all this information became available. And there is records on that. Where exactly this camp is that you're mentioning, I don't know. But those are the only 2 countries that I know where these kind of records are available. If you look at Poland, where 3 million Jews were murdered, it's probably take a whole library to put that together, and I don't know if it's even feasible.
I know I was there.
And this was in which part of Belgium or?
Well, this was in Austria. In Austria.
Okay, no, I wouldn't have any information really at all. I can't help you there. I really don't have that information. Any other questions? Well, if there's no other questions, once again, let me thank you for your kindness and being here and listening and making it easier to carry on for myself from day to day and passing this message on. Thank you.
Thank you.